very rural. Good pick.
It's hard to find. Okay, good morning, everyone. It is 10 o'clock on the dot, and we're getting ready to start our session. We'll give folks a few seconds to get in on the call, and then we can get started. So welcome. I'm glad you're here with us today for the Colorado Rural Housing Preservation Academy Local Policy Solutions session. I'm going to give folks till 10:02 before we get started. Good morning, Katie. Okay, y'all, we'll go on and get started. I am Robin Wolff, and I am the host of today's session. I work for Enterprise Community Partners as the Senior Program Director for Rural Housing for Enterprise, and I am located out of the Denver office. And so I'm really excited to bring you this session today. We've been talking a lot about what we can do at the local level as rural communities and across the state to really make sure that housing is preserved. And also we'll talk a bit about housing creation today as well. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. We've got a lot of good guests who are coming to join us, some from local communities that have implemented some great strategies and solutions in their own communities, like Steamboat Springs and Broomfield. And then also you'll get to meet a couple of my colleagues here at Enterprise who are doing work on the ground here in the state of Colorado, and we can talk about how we can continue to promote and promote preservation together and to work with you to support those. So run through a few introduction housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded. You should have heard that when you first logged in. That does mean that everybody who's registered will get a link to the recording after. So just know that that's available to you. Please use your chat feature to submit questions during the presentation. There's also the Q&A feature. I'll be monitoring that as well. And the raise hand feature. All participants will receive a copy of today's webinar recording, as I said earlier. And as always in this new world, please be patient with us as we navigate technical difficulties, particularly today, because normally I am joined by my colleague, Adrienne Norwood, who is able to help me troubleshoot this. And today she was double booked to help with another webinar. So you've got me today, and hopefully we'll all get through it together. Just brief agenda introductions. I'll be handling those and doing a little bit of kind of landscape setting for local policy toolbox, essentially. And then we'll be joined by my colleague, Katherine McKenna from Enterprise, followed by Katherine Meyer from Steamboat Springs. She will be presenting on their local affordable housing funds and have some time for Q&A. We will honor our 5-minute break at that hour. I think it's really important to keep us all engaged. And then move on to some conversation about what's going on with local policy in light of COVID. And that will be, the overview will be provided by Kinsey Hadstedt here at Enterprise. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on with late fees. Jack Regenbogen from CCLP will be joining us, and Sharon Tessier from Broomfield, Councilwoman from Broomfield, will be joining us as well to talk about how they got some late fee solutions in on the ground in her community. A little bit about Enterprise. Our vision and mission is that one day every person will have an affordable home in a vibrant community filled with promise and the opportunity for good life, and to create opportunity for low and moderate income people through affordable housing in diverse and thriving communities. The Rural and Native American Program provides funding and technical assistance to organizations to help create healthy, safe, green, affordable housing in rural and Native communities. And our priorities consist of preserving affordable rural housing through technical assistance and the delivery of trainings such as these. So that is what guides this work of the Colorado Rural Housing Preservation Academy. We are in our 5th topic, and I think something like 10th session of the Preservation Academy. As we moved virtually, we've created more sessions, but our 5th topic, and we will have 2 policy sessions. Today is the local housing policy session, really focusing on jurisdiction. So cities, counties, and towns. Our next session will be November 4th. Yes, it is the day after the election. And we will be talking about state policy, and we will be talking about national policy. What we will know that's different from the election, but also just really talking about how we can advocate for things that we need to see in our communities, as well as what a lot of that topic will be. Hopefully we'll know a little bit about certain amendments that have passed and things along those lines as well. So looking forward to those conversations. We will have a property management session later in November, and then in December, we will have a conversation about disaster preparedness. So thinking about things like wildfires, how do we prepare and create mitigation plans for those? And that should be a very good session as well. This is just the framework of the Preservation Academy. We are currently kind of in, I don't even know what phase of this rubric we fit into right now. I would say this is a lot about like stewardship. How do we as community members really engage folks within our community to make sure that there's still opportunities for housing in our communities? And here are our partners. I want to make sure that I acknowledge our sponsors. This project is brought to us by Colorado Health Foundation, Fannie Mae, and the Colorado Trust. So all of that said, I see Councilwoman Tessier has joined us. We're going to start off with just an overview, and this is what I call the local policy toolbox. And so what the local policy toolbox consists of is really a lot of different kind of categories or buckets that we see local policy solutions fitting into. These buckets are ways that we can promote preservation or just affordable housing development and affordability within our communities. They do not need to happen on the state level. All of these happen on either a city, town, or town level. So the list is notice and right of first refusal laws, extended affordability periods, code enforcement, information collection, such as a preservation database, policy coordination, financial incentives for affordable housing production, by right development, and zoning. And some of these overlap, of course. They're not all super distinct categories, but we'll go into each of these. The first one, and one that I am really interested in, is the notice and right of first refusal laws. These are laws that require owners of rental properties to give residents advance notice of intention to sell. And they really need to be combined with a way to make sure the residents know how they could answer and respond to that. So meaning that we need to think about how to connect those residents with either nonprofit organizations or land trust or groups that might be able to help them mobilize to actually act on that notice. Right of first refusal laws can vary in the length of time. This is important because figuring out how to get action in a shorter period of time is more difficult than a longer period of time. They typically range from 30 to 90 days. In some cases, the tenants can purchase the property themselves, like a co-op sort of model, or they can transfer their rights to nonprofit or mission-driven for-profit that agrees to maintain the property. And there's multiple factors that need to be placed. The tenants need to connect with an entity that has experience with this, and hopefully there's some sort of measure as you're thinking about creating a law or a regulation like this. And then funding is needed to make the transaction work. So a right of first refusal just means that someone has the opportunity to buy it, but you would have to have the capital in order to buy it. So figuring out what the resources are available to us or to those residents or to the local, affordable housing nonprofit about how to actually get that land acquired. It's a step in the right direction though, and it's one I think that is relatively less controversial maybe than others, so something to consider. If you have, just curious, if you have a right of first refusal law in your local community and you're not in the city of Denver, and you want to let us know in the chat, I'd be interested to know how you feel that's working. Extended affordability period. So this one's a little tricky for our rural communities because a lot of times the lever that's used for the extended affordability period could be investment of jurisdictional CDBG or home dollars, and that's not broadly available throughout the state. We work with the Division of Housing to get those dollars into non-metro communities. But anytime that you are going to make an investment, maybe there's a donation of land that your city owns or that the school district owns or something along those lines, you might want to consider adding a land use restriction agreement that would set the amount of time for the affordability period. And that can be up to you. So for example, in the city of Denver, the affordability period that went along with investment of dollars from the city of Denver was, I think, originally 25. It just got extended to 60 years. So this is another tool that we have within our local communities, particularly if we are making an investment. It could also be through infrastructure or some other pieces that you're making an investment on that you add that as a requirement of getting the funds or having the participation in that funding. Code enforcement. This one's a bit tricky. I think that sometimes we find as housing providers that code enforcement from municipalities can be kind of tricky, but it's really important for us to note that well-executed code enforcement really helps, particularly with naturally occurring affordable housing. But what we really also want to note is that code enforcement works better with rehabilitation tools. So thinking about what might be available in your community in single family housing, this could be the 504 home repair program. It could be Energy Outreach Colorado's programs and or other like home repair programs in your community. And one thing to really think about is how do we figure out how to rehab units so they can stay in service and are the quality of units that we really want to be housing people in. sometimes the units are not able to be salvaged by the existing owner. They don't have interest or the capital to salvage them. And so how do you think about if you're going to have to shut a property down from a code enforcement side as a municipality? How do you think about what you're going to do to preserve that property? There's question mark like land. I don't have the answer to this question. I think it's just something we need to consider. Reduced and waived fees. I think this one is a really important one. And then often folks will ask me, well, what are all those fees? And I have a really fun list that I can read to you in just a bit. But local jurisdictions can encourage the development of new housing by reducing or waiving fees for qualifying projects. The specific set of fees may be waived by city staff, and others might have to be approved. Like, so we can get a little bit more into that, into the by right discussion. This could codify a waiver for the entire jurisdiction or only in certain areas. So meaning you could say in the entire city of Westminster, we're going to waive the application fee, for example, or the fee in lieu of park for affordable housing development. Or you could say, we are going to waive the fee in lieu of park for affordable housing development in the transit areas, or the TOD station areas. So there's two different ways you can think of these fee reductions or waivers, depending upon what you're trying to encourage. It could also be in communities where you really want to see more affordable development is where you waive those fees. So there's different ways to target this. And some communities limit eligibility for fee waivers and reductions to nonprofit organizations. Others make it available to all projects that meet affordability criteria. So that would be up to your local city council or town council as to how they want to think about that. That's true of everything we'll talk about right now. These are all up to your local jurisdiction, but that means there's a lot of power within your local jurisdiction to make changes. Just to give us an idea of fees that hit like an affordable housing project, you've got like a public works construction inspection fee, a watershed protection fee, a traffic impact analysis fee, a zoning fee, an interim zoning fee, board of adjustment fee, all sorts of different fees that can be added on the municipal level. And they all serve a purpose, and they were all added on to serve a purpose, but there might be a set of fees that could be waived in order to further encourage affordable housing. It's just something to consider. This one's huge, incentives for housing production and preservation, and we will be joined by Katherine Meyer of Steamboat Springs shortly, and she will be able to tell us a little bit about what they've done in, she's here on the call, good. A little bit about what they've done in Steamboat to do this at a local level, and I'm really excited to hear about that. There's also a local fund in Summit County here in the state of Colorado. One thing I think is really important about this is that, especially for things like preservation, is thinking about the flexibility of these funds. How do we think about the gap that comes between what it costs to redevelop the property and what can be raised through either tax credits or private financing? Is there a way that these funds can make the need for tax credits not necessary, which would be great? Funds that allow for the backlog of accumulated capital needs. This happens often. The CNA comes back, the capital needs assessment comes back for our properties, especially our aged properties, that really long and lengthy. So how can these funds be utilized for that purpose? And then pre-development funding or availability of pre-development funding that help to facilitate the investigation of that property, or to have some groups act quickly. Going really close in hand, this could be used really close in hand with the right of first refusal policy as well. So one thing that's really important to consider, which is not a regulation or or code or anything of that nature. It is just the importance of policy coordination. So thinking about how you can incorporate preservation concerns into your HUD mandated consolidated plan, right? Ensure that preservation incentives align with the other priorities. So you might say we're going to, in the plan, we have a lack of how many units. And so the plan often focuses on how you're going to develop new units, but making sure that you highlight also key to that is making sure that units that are at risk of being lost are retained is huge to point out. If you have like a local COG or Council of Governments, thinking about ways to create consistency from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. This might be because you have a housing authority that covers multiple counties, and it makes it lots easier on developers if there's consistency in between and among the jurisdictions. So if you have a COG that already is getting those groups together, that is a great place to really think about these kinds of policies and a coordinated effort for these kinds of policies. Consistency with other funders. What are CHAFA's affordability period requirements? What are Division of Housing's affordability period requirements? Are the cities less? Are they more? Should they match? These are interesting things to think about, particularly as you're bringing in often all of these layers. If your, for example, requirement is 25 years, but CHAFA's is 40 years of affordability, any tax credit project will have the 40-year affordability period. Does that mean you want to think about making yours longer? It's something to think about. These are all just sort of things that we should think about coordinating. Working with a local housing authority. Here in the state of Colorado, we have property tax abatement only for housing authority or projects that are developed in partnership with housing authorities. That's the way that the state laws are written. And so as a consequence or as a piece of that conversation, it would be really important as a nonprofit or even for-profit affordable housing developer to look and see if they can create a meaningful partnership with that housing authority to allow for property tax abatement on that property. And establishing the preservation committee or consortium of public housing authorities, nonprofits, government agencies, and other members to support that work. And then zoning. I honestly think this might be the heaviest lift with the least words on my slides, but really zoning things that we really should look at on the city level that can create impediments or barriers to affordable housing. This is really on the development side often, is parking requirements, density, really thinking about considering density bonuses or allowances for greater density if you are building affordable housing. Accessory dwelling units, there's lots of conversations about accessory dwelling units right now. There's also called granny flats or alley flats. But this is a way to create more stock in a community. And if you have a community that's really interested in the residential look of a community, accessory dwelling units might be an easier sell than others, but they have to be allowed in the zoning. So thinking about how you could do that, or if accessory dwelling units are not being built in your community, looking at the factors as to why that is and what you could do to make that easier or more available. And then consider by right. So I think by right is really just a fancy way of saying, as an affordable housing developer with these affordable housing restrictions in place, you are by right allowed this specific set of fee reductions, waivers, parking allowances, things of that nature. This last bullet is really food for thought. Inclusionary zoning is something that's complicated right now in the state of Colorado, and next session we will talk a little bit more about Telluride and how there's some legislation going on at the state level that might make inclusionary zoning more available to us and our local communities and more understood how we could apply it and how we could use it in order to really support local development. So that was like super quick and dirty version of all of the possible policy solutions that you could implement on the local level. So with that, I would like to introduce my colleague, Katie McKenna. Katie is the Senior Program Director at Enterprise Community Partners out of the Denver office. And in the days where there's an office, we are in like what I call a pod. We're like a group of narwhals swimming through the ocean of affordable housing. And so I'm really happy to have Katie here. She's going to talk a little bit about some tools that Enterprise has that might be able to help you understand the landscape where you are and to support your advocacy efforts locally.
Thanks, Robin. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you today. One of the big challenges that Enterprise, but also everyone has faced over the last several months is where to find good data in this rapidly changing environment of a pandemic. We need good data so that we can make programmatic decisions and adjustments to our work to meet the changing needs of the people that we're trying to serve, and also to advance policy solutions that are responsive to what we never expected to happen in 2020. So in response, Enterprise has created 2 data aggregators to help us better understand the impact of the pandemic and have the information that we need to make programmatic and policy decisions. So in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to share these really easy to use tools with you. And I really love these resources because if you can use Zoom, you can use them and in just 15 minutes, pull together impactful information from reliable data sources and be able to find everything all in one place, which I think is so valuable. So I'm going to share my screen really quick with the first aggregator. This tool is called the COVID-19 Impact Tracker, and it aggregates data from the Census, the Department of Labor, and the Public Health Department. So what you see up on my screen right now, this is a dashboard from the COVID-19 Impact Tracker. I chose Chaffee County as an example. The COVID-19 Impact Tracker gives us state and local data. So you can see we have the Chaffee County unemployment rate. We can also toggle over to the state unemployment rate. We can track COVID-19 cases as well as hospitalizations, or I'm sorry, confirmed deaths. We can track weekly unemployment filings as well as the housing insecurity rate. We can also look at the racial and ethnic makeup of the location that we're interested in. Over here on the right side of the screen, some key demographics, so things like median household income, the percent of the population that's not white, some economic security indicators, housing stability indicators, and health and well-being indicators. So we can look at, this gives us a good snapshot of some of the vulnerabilities as well as the impacts of COVID-19 in both our state and our local community. So the second tool, and I'll share the link to all of these in the chat as soon as I'm finished. The second tool that I'm going to share, this is Opportunity 360, which if you have known Enterprise for a while, you may have heard of Opportunity 360. Opportunity 360 is a data tool that looks at housing through the lens of opportunity. So opportunity we think of opportunity as health and well-being, access to quality education, financial security and job access, as well as housing security. So Opportunity 360, this tool has been around for 3 or 4 years now, and has a lot of other data in it. So I encourage you just to kind of click around and play with it. But what we've added recently is these COVID-19 impacts. One of the other great things about Opportunity 360, it's the easiest to use. All you do is, if you know the census tract of the area that you are interested in, or you can submit multiple census tracts, you send an email to Opportunity 360. The link is on our website, and I'll share it in the chat. And you receive in your email a report for the area or areas that you've requested. So you don't even have to do any navigating in a tool with this one. So what we've added recently is COVID-19 impacts. This is just part of the data report that you'll receive in your inbox. And you can scroll through. We have the COVID-19 impacts in all the opportunity indicators. So health and well-being, financial security, quality education, and housing stability. And you can scroll down and just take a look at that for the very specific neighborhood or census tract that you're interested in. So the final thing that I'm going to share with you all this morning, we think that being able to both access data is really important, but also being able to share it in an easy way. So we created, in partnership with some of our CDC partners here in the Denver area, we created an easy template to help all of us be able to communicate the impacts of COVID-19 in our community. So give me one more minute to share my screen a different way. All right. So this is the template that we created, or this is a sample, actually. This happens to be for the East Colfax neighborhood in Denver, but you can create it for any census tract in your own community. So it's just a snapshot of some of the impacts of the pandemic. And then, so this is a sample with all of the data inputted. And when you take a look at the link that I'll share in the chat, the second page is this template that you can adjust for your own community. And if you hover over if you hover over these speech bubbles or click on them in the comments, you can see exactly where to pull your local data from. And all of the information in this tool comes from either the COVID-19 impact tracker, which again provides state and local data, or the Opportunity 360 report, which is the neighborhood or census tract level. It's not fancy, it's just a PowerPoint, so you can also make any other adjustments that you want. You can add your logo, you can change the color, you can delete one of the sections and put in something that's more important to you, or add a picture. Anything that you want to do with this template, you're more than welcome to. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and see if anyone has any questions about some of the COVID-19 impacts or data that we have. And,
so Katie,
sorry, I'm a little slow with the chat. Go ahead.
I think we're good so far in chat. I was just curious, you'll be able to send this to us. Will you send us a link in chat, or do we want me to send it out after the session?
Yeah, I can put everything in the chat, and then you're welcome to share with anyone else who wasn't able to make it, or in any other way.
Great, thank you. I can see how that could be really helpful based on like just as people come to us, especially like our local policymakers come to us for data, and then this is a way that we can really easily track it. Katie's also available to help you navigate some of it. I know sometimes as we get into the tool, it gets confusing. So and I will do my best, but I'm not as smart as Katie is at it. So if you would like to ask one of us here at Enterprise for some help with that tool, we'd be happy to navigate that for you or with you. Thank you so much, Katie. I really appreciate it. We're excited about this tool here at Enterprise. We know that it's going to allow us to really do, I think, some advocacy, particularly as we're looking at current COVID data. We also have some availability to just really look at some jurisdictional data about affordable housing as well in that tool. So once that information gets shared and you have questions, let us know. I am going to go on and introduce our guest speaker from Steamboat Springs. Our guest is Kathy Meyer. She is the Mayor Pro Tem of Steamboat Springs, and she has been instrumental in their local affordable housing fund that they have set up. So Kathy, if you're able to, I think you should be able to share your screen with us and see us. And if you'd like to let us know a little bit about that program, that would be amazing.
I've unmuted. Am I not
Nope,
on
not
the
you.
Pardon?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
You're going to have to help me because this dashboard's not what I'm used to.
Okay, no worries. Let me see if I can do this. I'll do my best. Ask to start video. I think I sent you a request, Kathy, so hopefully that will help.
Start my video. Got it.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you.
Alrighty. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So I would just like to say that you're going to get a little bit more than just the Community Housing Fund history, because it didn't just happen by itself. It was an evolution of a lot of things, some of which were planned and some of which were unplanned. And that's not unusual in the world of affordable housing. You have to take what you can get sometimes. So my involvement here goes back to 1996, when I was on the Planning Commission and was appointed to the nonprofit that was called the Regional Affordable Living Foundation. And at that time, it had one employee, no assets, and other than a mission to create affordable housing here in Steamboat. In 2000, Ralph, which is the Regional Affordable Housing Foundation, acquired 55-unit apartment from the USDA as a it was a project where the management had not paid any back taxes. And so we were able to acquire it for no money down. And the USDA gave us an additional loan to help renovate the project, which was in sorely need of renovation. During that time, we developed a community plan that said, you know, having a nonprofit's fine, but we really should look at, as a community, a housing authority. And at that time, you might remember there was some legislation that was passed that created what's called a multi-jurisdictional housing authority. And Steamboat looked at both business models and decided that the benefits of the multi-jurisdictional housing authority outweighed a nonprofit. And primarily was because a housing authority is a political subdivision of the state of Colorado and has the ability to tax. And Robin, as you mentioned, any project that is involved may be subject to all or some of property tax waivers. And so partnering with housing authorities became something that most developers looked at and most developers embraced. So the city of Steamboat Springs and Routt County commissioners formed the Yampa Valley Housing Authority, and they were the primary funders, together with a grant from the state through the Colorado Division of Housing. In 2004, we realized that the city council said, you know, what we really need is inclusionary zoning. And it just so happened that the timing, our original inclusionary zoning plan required the developer to build units. It did not allow for a fee in lieu method. And 3 years later, when the recession hit, the developers came back to city council and said, you know, our market rate units have fallen 30 to 50%. And our deed restricted units or our inclusionary zoning units have fallen likewise, and we can't sell them. And what good is having units sit? And so they were able to convince City Council to amend our inclusionary zoning ordinance. And this is the part where I think, I don't know whether this would have been amended had the recession not hit, had Steamboat not been drastically affected as far as real estate values. So the developers were able to pay a fee in lieu. And at that time, in 2007, the Community Housing Fund was created. And this is a special fund to account for revenues and expenditures related to community housing. The primary source of this fund has been inclusionary zoning fees that have been suspended for the last several years. So after the inclusionary zoning fees were put in place, the development community kept saying, you know, you're unfairly punishing one group. And because development and construction was one of the highest segment of our employment population, they held a very powerful sway in terms of lobbying the city council. And in the meantime, the housing authority had gone from one project to, it was starting its third project. And I have to tell you that the housing authority probably hit, again, when you talk about timing, we had a 48 unit, our first LIHTC project. And we used monies from the Community Housing Fund to create the public match that was necessary. So about $500,000 that was in the community fund was part of the match. The apartment complex that was built was a 48 unit LIHTC, a 9% LIHTC deal that was rented literally in one day. We didn't look at the calendar, and we decided we would do a rental of, or a leasing event in February. And we had people lined up at 3 a.m. in below zero weather just to put an application in. So we had several hundred people for the 48 units. We realized that the LIHTC method, by partnering with our community housing fund, was powerful. But in the meantime, we realized that the community was in a position that we should ask for a mill levy, which we did, because the housing authority has the ability to put a tax on the ballot. We didn't have to go to the city. We didn't have to go to the county. We had the power to ask the voters for a mill levy. And we were very frugal. We asked for 1 mill, which generates about $900,000 a year. And that goes into a tax fund with the housing authority. So we have been able to use both the monies in the community housing fund and the tax fund to leverage the equity that we need to fund our projects. And we are currently, our most recent project is a 72 unit hybrid project that has not only 48 units at 30% to 60% AMI, but we also realize that we have needs beyond the low income level that the Colorado Division of Housing is using. So we actually used some of our tax money and leveraged it to build 24 units additional in the complex. They're intermingled, so you don't know, you have no idea who's paying what. It's one complex in 3 buildings, and so if you've come to Steamboat recently, you'll see our latest project. And then we are currently, and I don't know if I should mention this, we have a request in 2 Chaffa to do a 4% deal, which would be our first 4% deal. And again, we have used $500,000 from our community housing fund together with $1 million of our tax money. And I would say that going to the voters and asking for a small tax levy, a mill levy, was, we were very successful and had over 60% of our voters voting to tax themselves, which that was the first tax, a property tax in Steamboat in 40 years. We're primarily a sales tax tourist organization or tourist town. So, you know, I think by having both funds, they've been able to leverage each other. And there's only, we've basically spent our community housing fund down to $100,000. And what we use that money for is to supplement our administrative costs at the housing authority. And the county uses its general fund to fund about $50,000 a year. So we're still using and getting government funds because both the city and the county recognize affordable housing is a basic service that they need to provide. And we have our mix is a lot of service jobs, low-paying service jobs. And yet those are your waiters, your housekeepers, your shuttle drivers. And so we really value our low-income workforce. So that's about the story with the Community Housing Fund, and I'd like to answer any questions.
Well, that's a lot to unpack, Kathy. I really appreciate you highlighting the confluence that needed to happen between the mill levy and the tax funds and the community housing funds. So what you said is you had your inclusionary housing ordinance, and your fee in lieu of was originally seeding the money for the community housing fund. And then now that's not happening anymore because of the development community. Is that correct? And
because the housing authority has its own tax, and that's being paid broadly by all property owners, the development community was able to persuade the city council that source of funds should no longer be used, and not used, that they should no longer be paying it. Now, the demand or the need far exceeds the 1 mill levy. The 1 mill levy was a 10-year proposal. So the question is, and the promise to the community was to create 650 units. So we are, about a third of the way through of creating those units. Our hope is that we prove worthy and can go back and get a reallocation of the tax. In the meantime, we have become very active, we as the Housing Authority, and I should mention I am a board member. I was its first president. So I'm also a city council member, but I'm a board member of the Housing Authority. We have gotten very active in property management because we believe that if we manage the units where we have ownership, and maybe not entire ownership, we have partners in all these deals, then the the funding, we can be self-sustaining, and that's really our goal, is between tax and property management fee to be self-sustaining. Now, we haven't neglected our for sale properties, but the economics, the amount of subsidy is so great. I should throw a number out. Our cheapest lot in Steamboat is $200,000. So when you're trying to build for sale housing, you're ending up with a house. If it's a single family house, you're looking at $500,000, $600,000, $700,000. So it's very difficult, but we have some ideas on how to create that. So yeah. I see we have some questions.
Yeah, we have one from Beth Truby at Chaffa, and her question is, what do you think led to the success of passing the mill levy?
I think it was a real awareness by the community that housing is a great need. And we were lucky in that we had just built our first Chaffa project, which I think is hanging on your wall in Denver, a picture. And it really turned out very nice, to the point where people thought it was a condo project. It did not have the stigma of, oh, that's driving by and saying, oh, that's an affordable housing project. So we were able to say, look, this is what we have built. This is our vision. And it's going to be complementary to the community and all the other development that's gone on here. So we paid a lot of money, and I think that we did a lot of tours of our project so that voters could see the quality. There's one other thing, and that is we told the personal story of the people that were tenants in that building. And it was really life-changing to some of them. And I think that's about as powerful as an ad as you can get when you're running a ballot request, when you talk about lives changing for the better. And so I think that was also a powerful motivator.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Those personal stories of members of your community are hugely important. So just building on that, how much did it cost to support this ballot initiative? You know, it sounds like you probably had to do some communication, like mailings, things like that. Like how would you recommend, if there's a local housing authority that's thinking about going through a mill levy, what do they need to have prepared to embark upon that endeavor?
First of all, under Colorado rules, the housing authority cannot lobby. So what you have to do is create a citizens group, which even if you're a board member, you're allowed to act as a citizen. We did go out and fundraise to help us get yard signs, do advertising, and this was we raised somewhere in the neighborhood of about $20,000. And I think we used every bit of it, but our original budget was 10. We had a very generous donor who felt that she wanted it to be very successful. And so we had a private donor that matched our fundraiser. And so, again, it really depends. And nowadays you can use so much more social media. And, we had one local paper, and so we had to pay their rates. So we were a bit of a captive audience there. I see how much additional property tax does the average household pay. It's about $70 a year. And our average household's about $700,000. I believe that we we didn't talk about average cost per year. We talked about average cost per day. So it was something like a quarter or a dime. And I mean, it was really a very low amount. That was the other thing. But by having a 1 mil levy, it, you know, other entities have gone for much larger reimbursements, and we decided that we would start small and hopefully be victorious, which we were.
You've got me thinking about a lot of different things, Kathy. But I wanted to go, I think, back to, as you were looking once you established that multi-jurisdictional housing authority, did you have other small housing authorities that were serving smaller jurisdictions, like for just Steamboat Springs, for example, or were there no operating housing authorities in the area when you decided to go about doing that?
There were no housing authorities in the area. There was this one nonprofit I spoke about earlier. And I know that because of the way the laws were, other mountain housing authorities were part of either the city or the counties. And we just, as a community, did not evolve along that way. We we still have some local nonprofits that own and operate two adult or senior housing. You know, we also had a chapter of Habitat for Humanity. So it wasn't that we didn't have different entities that were working on different segments of affordable housing. We just had not gone to other housing authorities.
No, that's great. And then just to clarify, what jurisdictions are part of the Yampa Valley Housing Authority? So
right now, the city of Steamboat Springs and unincorporated Routt County. We have, because we passed the ballot, any entity that would join us would also have to be subject to the tax. And some of our other smaller communities have said, well, we're more than glad to join, but we don't want to pay any money. And so we said, no, that's not the way the law works. So we have not expanded our jurisdiction, but the charter does allow for it. And we're hoping someday that some of our other smaller communities within Routt County will join us.
Right, because there's still other places like Hayden and stuff that don't have a housing authority necessarily, and they're not in your jurisdiction, right? That is really, really helpful, Kathy. Thank you for sharing with us, and thank you for your legacy of affordable housing and thinking about it from a whole bunch of different viewpoints and perspectives, as it sounds like you have throughout your career, and you know, as a real supporter and advocate for affordable housing and making it work. We have seen the successful and beautiful, like you said, those projects that have recently gone up in Steamboat are really beautiful developments, and so something to be very proud of. So that is really, if there's no other audience questions, which I don't see any right now, we'll wrap up and we'll take a 5-minute break, everyone. So it's 10:58. We will start back at 11:03. And Kathy, thank you again for joining us. And you're welcome to leave our call or to come back and hear what has to be said, what's going on about late fees and Broomfield and some other things that are happening in other communities within the state.
Very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, everyone, we're on break until 11:03. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Everybody's right on time, which is always appreciated. And we are here with our next set of speakers for this morning. So I first want to introduce you to my colleague, Kenzie Hadstedt. She is the Policy Director, I think that's right, Kenzie,
right. Yeah.
at Enterprise Community Partners here in the Denver office, serving the Colorado market. And again, is part of my pod of narwhals as we swim in our ocean of affordable housing here. I don't know. My son reads a lot of narwhal books right now, so narwhals is very much in my lexicon. So, and we're also joined by Jack Regenberger, who is who's at the Colorado Center for Law and Policy, and will be speaking with us about late fees as well and how they affect. But we'll start with Kenzie. So, Kenzie, take it away.
All right. Thank you all for having me here this morning. And I'm going to see if I can share my screen so you can see my slides. One moment. Does that look good to folks? Can you see my screen? Jack, I can see you. Okay, cool.
Yes.
So I'm going to go into presentation mode. So I'm Kenzie Hadstedt. I'm pleased to be one of Robin's colleagues in the Denver market for enterprise, working on state and local policy. I am happy to be called a narwhal. Robin, I don't know if you know this, but when I lived in DC, I was part of a very consistent, if not extremely successful trivia team, and we were called the narwhals. So happy to be one again. So I am here to talk with you all today a bit about some options for local policy in helping to prevent evictions in this day and age of COVID and folks who are so negatively economically impacted by the pandemic. And then the second part, I'll actually talk a little bit about some advocacy strategies that we have had some success with, and we hope can provide some inspiration for you all in how to really engage your organizational partners and your local media in obtaining some of these policy changes, whether they're responsive to the COVID emergency or if they're longer term, like what Robin spoke about earlier today. So I also know that there are folks on this call who have their own expertise, both in policy options and in advocacy. So toward the end, I welcome anyone's thoughts or contributions as well. So I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of where we are today with the state of federal and state policy with regard to specifically eviction prevention in light of COVID-19. Go into some local policy options that we at Enterprise would suggest, and then again, look at some advocacy tactics and resources for you all. So starting with the state of federal and state policy today, at the federal level, I'm sure many, if not all of you, are aware that the CDC took the extraordinary step of issuing an eviction moratorium a number of weeks ago, which for folks who qualify, and there are some eligibility criteria, but those folks cannot be evicted from their homes due to an inability to pay their rent, at least through the end of the year. That's how long the CDC order lasts. There is a declaration form that folks have to submit in order to prove and attest that they do fall under those eligibility criteria. But after that point, a landlord or property owner is not to evict an eligible person who's been negatively economically impacted by COVID. There are also a couple of protections for multifamily properties and single family homes that are in some kind of mortgage forbearance if their mortgages are backed by the Federal Housing Finance Agency or by the Federal Housing Administration. And if those properties are in that mortgage forbearance, they are under a number of restrictions as well, including not in order to not evict tenants for lack of payment. And of course, the CARES Act was the last major federal piece of COVID relief that we saw. It was a number of months ago. There continue to be ongoing negotiations that start and stop at the federal level. But I think the bottom line is that we're not going to see additional federal funding and relief for tenants and landlords anytime soon. But there has been $30 million allocated at the state level from CARES Act funding to rental and mortgage relief assistance. And the governor recently allocated another about $2.5 million to that program here in Colorado. At the state level, some exciting news, which Jack and I were talking about a little bit as we came back from the break. So earlier today, Governor Polis issued a statewide eviction moratorium specific to Colorado. This is something that through the course of the governor had convened a special eviction prevention task force pretty much through the month of September that Robbins and my colleague Jenny Rogers served on, along with 9 other folks from the affordable housing industry. Jenny and Enterprise, along with a lot of our partners, including Jack from CCLP, who we'll be speaking to all briefly, really advocated quite strongly through that eviction prevention task force in order to get some strong recommendations out of the task force and in order to get the governor to take some strong action to help protect renters at risk of eviction and landlords who are having a hard time making ends meet. And so one of the recommendations that came from that task force and that the governor acted on today is issuing a state-specific eviction moratorium. This one will help ensure that even if the CDC's order is vacated in court, which could happen because there are a lot of agencies and entities seeking to undermine it, Colorado will still have a prevention against folks being evicted here in the state. And so I had jotted down some quick notes, just since this is so new, I wanted to highlight it for you all. So here in Colorado, starting today, and at least for the next 30 days, and hopefully the governor will continue to renew this order, but folks cannot be evicted, again, if they qualify for lacking payment. They cannot be evicted if their lease came to an end or if they're on a month-to-month tenancy. So if someone's lease were just going to end anyway, folks can't be evicted for that reason if they're qualifying. Folks cannot be evicted for any non-substantial violation of their lease. And there's a prohibition on executing evictions that have already been filed. So if something has been initiated and it hasn't been fully carried out, that is put to a stop. And there's a provision in there that I read as stating that folks cannot be removed from their homes, nor can their belongings be removed from their homes, including outside of the formal eviction process. So I think there are a lot of questions on implementation, which Jack and I were talking about, and that I can get into a bit in our talk about local policy options. But I'll really highlight this as one of the big things that just happened at the state level. A couple of other things just to briefly highlight here at the bottom. The governor has also issued an executive order prohibiting landlords and property owners from assessing late fees or compounding interest through the end of this year. And, requiring, this has been in place for some time and continues to be renewed, that a landlord or property owner who makes a demand for rent for someone who hasn't paid needs to provide 30 days for folks to come up with funds before initiating or filing an eviction. But the statewide eviction moratorium is really kind of overarching, and I think hopefully a helpful policy. So now to move on to some of the local options to help keep folks housed through the course of this pandemic. Enterprise has been considering some of these options in 5 different buckets here. And I have to acknowledge all of the additional thinking and partnership from many of our partners who are on the call that have gone into identifying some of these priorities and options. So first is thinking about providing, or particularly I think at the local level, implementing some clear legal protections for residents who've been negatively impacted by the pandemic. A second bucket of recommendations has to do with really ensuring that no tenant who is eligible for rental assistance is evicted. And much of that, again, has to do with implementation. A third bucket really looks to landlords and ensuring that they have the resources that are necessary to continue to maintain their operations and provide safe, stable, and healthy housing for their residents throughout the course of the pandemic. Fourth is thinking about how to continue to protect and rehouse tenants who, if they have had an eviction initiated or filed against them. And then a fifth is thinking about how we track evictions and the resource allocation through this pandemic in order to ensure that folks' needs are being addressed equitably and perhaps to inform a more equitable policy interventions in the future. So I'm going to go briefly through a couple of these options under each of the 5 buckets. And I know you all will get the slides after this, so I may just pick one from each slide to really elevate. So thinking about the legal protections part, I'm going to go ahead and highlight the top one here. of ensuring consistent implementation of federal and state level protections. I think a lot of this falls both to local governments and to courts throughout the state. We've been talking about that among a coalition of our organizations. So for instance, thinking about the statewide eviction moratorium issued today, I think a lot of this will now go to, advocacy organizations, like many of those represented on the call, and working with state judicial and different county and local level courts to ensure that the information that tenants have the information about the eviction moratorium and know that they can be protected, and to ensure that courts consistently apply all of these things. And I know that that's a different step, working with different judicial districts and advocating and connecting with them can be challenging sometimes, but I think there is a lot to say there. Oops, excuse me. Well, and I'll highlight this second one. So encouraging or requiring landlords to work with tenants on reasonable repayment plans. I think a big thing that we worry about, even with eviction moratoriums, is that we don't wind up with tenants who are really just kind of accruing more and more debt, and then that comes due, and we wind up with a big problem anyway. And so Seattle and Chicago and some other cities have implemented this where they require landlords to create reasonable repayment plans with tenants who are able to remain housed through the pandemic. The governor has encouraged, in Colorado, Governor Polis has encouraged municipalities to use a reasonable repayment plan that's been drawn up by DOLA. But this can be another really helpful policy. Ensuring that no one who is eligible for rental assistance is evicted is really critical, because along with the legal protections, we need the funding, again, both for tenants and for landlords. So in Colorado, this CARES Act funding has gone through the state through a number of different programs, but I wanted to highlight the Property Owner Preservation Program, or POP, and the Emergency Housing Assistance Program, or EHAP, that are being administered by the state. POP is a program that landlords can apply for rental assistance on behalf of tenants, and EHAP is a program where tenants individually can apply for rental assistance. Both of those, lots of information is available on the Division of Housing's website, and we'd be happy to chat more about those if necessary. But I think the state government, as well as local governments and municipalities, really can do a lot to make sure that folks are aware of and know how to access these resources. And then at the local opportunity level, I would really highlight minimizing barriers to people's ability to obtain assistance. Whether it's a state level program or if your local government has a specific program for rental assistance, or others that can be directed either through a foundation or the government to folks who are in need, making sure that those who really need it are able to access it is really critical, and a lot can happen at the local level. So removing any unnecessary qualification requirements. So only if a funding stream has certain restrictions on it, should those be applied. For instance, for documentation, any funds that can go toward undocumented folks really should be clear that they're open to those folks, because they face so many barriers. And minimizing the burden of proof for tenants to be able to demonstrate that they need assistance are a couple of examples of how you can minimize barriers. Thinking about supporting landlords' capacity to maintain their operations, again, I think investing in these implementation and communication efforts at the local level, both for what resources are available from the state, and if there's anything available in your local government or from foundations, making sure folks know about it is a really worthwhile investment. And identifying any additional resources that may be there. I know that local government budgets, particularly for smaller and rural communities, can be quite tight right now. But I think going through 2021, a lot of folks are very concerned that we're going to run out of even existing resources for folks who need rental assistance. And so at as many levels as possible, particularly given the lack of federal clarity, it would be great to be able to work with partners to identify any additional resources you might have to share with folks. We also want to keep thinking about throughout the continuum. So if hopefully this has significantly reduced the risk of eviction now with this eviction protection order issued by the governor. But if someone does have an eviction filed and executed against them, really trying to think of how to continue to work with that person to make sure that they are rehoused or receive the services they need once an eviction has been initiated. And I would highlight, just out of curiosity, I wonder if folks on this call will have feedback toward the end, but the last bullet point here is something that we at Enterprise have put out there. We don't really know exactly how it would be operationalized, but for folks who are being evicted, the sheriff is really the one who would carry out the eviction order. And so we've been contemplating if there are ways to try to align rehousing resources and information with that sheriff's action. So that's more of an interesting thought that we've had, and just trying to continue to brainstorm new ideas. So I'd be interested in anyone's thoughts here on the call. And then the last piece is thinking about just making sure that local governments and nonprofit agencies are really tracking how, to the extent that we can, how evictions are happening, when they're being filed, how they are being resolved. This is a much bigger issue that a lot of advocates and the state have identified, the lack of transparency in eviction filings and awareness throughout the state. So thinking about ways to encourage local courts to make that data available, but also thinking again about the assistance and funding piece and making sure that to the extent possible, we're tracking how these resources are being distributed in the community, who is eligible and who is getting them, which we think would be really helpful. As Katie mentioned before, having the data and evidence about where funding is going would help inform a more equitable response in the future, both throughout the course of this pandemic and thinking more big picture, again, back to Robin's presentation, about where the need is and how we can really plug in resources better in the years ahead. So I'm going to move now to thinking about how to advocate for these policies and other policies that you all would want to see. Again, acknowledging there are some local government officials on the call and some really great advocates. I welcome others' input. But I really wanted to make sure, first and foremost, that we all embrace the fact that local government is accessible. I was listening to a city council committee hearing yesterday when I was working on the slide presentation. And I hope my colleagues on this group will forgive me, but I thought that it was a really good representation of just how normal and accessible local government officials are. My favorite is Councilman Cashman down in the corner. That's how I feel I look on Zoom calls all the time. So really encouraging folks who are not local government officials on the call to feel like they can reach out to and work with these folks, because they are amazing and hardworking and really want to hear from you all. So I'll cover two big buckets of ideas for you all today. One is organizing with your partners. We at Enterprise, I think pretty much everything we do is collaborative. Again, Jack from CCLP is on, and one of our best coalition partners. And I think it really adds to the work that you're trying to do when you're able to organize in coalition. And so I would suggest thinking about your usual partners, folks in the affordable housing industry, but also non-traditional partners, specifically maybe folks who are in the health industry. I think this pandemic has really elevated for everyone that housing is a public and individual level health issue. Thinking about intersection housing with racial equity, there's all kinds of opportunities to work with different organizations. And I think being in collaboration with others helps to elevate your policy priorities and helps elected officials know that these are priorities held by a large group of constituents. And so in reaching out to those public officials with your group of partners, a couple of ways we've had success is really through organizational sign-on letters and through meeting requests based on specific policy asks. So just a couple of recommendations here. In addition to collaborating, really direct your advocacy requests to the folks who have the authority over the change you want to see. Make sure that the asks are clearly enumerated and are upfront. Engaging other policymakers if it makes sense, given your audience, and to also consider involving implementing agencies. So a couple of examples. This is a sign-on letter that we worked on in coalition with a couple of organizations directed to Governor Polis earlier this year, requesting some eviction moratorium and specific actions. And just to highlight some pieces that are in this very wordy piece here. So one, we really started out, again, by enumerating our requests quite clearly. We included a number of other local elected officials since the request was to the governor, including Councilwoman Tessier, who I know is on the phone. Thank you for being with us on this. We all engaged a number of coalition partners and organizational supporters. And we copied and also sent the letter to the implementing agencies of the state to make sure that they knew what we were asking of the governor. And I think this was the beginning of what's turned into a months-long process, an advocacy and organizing process, but was really a great way to bring a lot of different people together on the same page. And this is a letter that was sent by a handful of organizations to Denver City Council, requesting that they consider suspending fees, which Jack and Councilwoman will speak about in Broomfield briefly here. But just again, another example of the power of working in coalition. I'll cover now pretty briefly to the idea of earned media, which has proved very successful for us. Largely, one of the ways we've done it is through op-eds in local papers. As local elected officials are really accessible, I think that particularly local papers and news outlets are as well. And so it's really just giving them something that they can turn around and publish quickly. I would find out your local paper's word limit. Op-eds tend to be short and quite punchy. I think it's really useful to present a clear point of view that would prompt community discussion, to put the call to action and who you want to act up front, to emphasize your expertise in the affordable housing community, and to utilize any supporting evidence that you have, whether it's through your organization or if you maybe are able to use Enterprise's COVID-19 impact tracker or Opportunities 360 dashboard that Katie presented to you all earlier. So again, two quick examples here, or just one rather. Jenny, my colleague, again, served on that special eviction prevention task force. And so while there was a formal report released from that, Jenny and one of her co-task force members authored and had in the Denver Post an op-ed calling on Governor Polis to take the actions that were presented. And this turned out to be a really useful strategy so that Beatriz and Jenny could get their take on how the task force went down and include some recommendations very clearly and calling the governor to take action. So that came out in conjunction with the report, and I think has been a helpful tool for advocates and others to hold the governor to account. And briefly, the last piece on earned media is thinking about how you might get media coverage of some of the work that you're doing already. So my example for this is, again, looking to my friends at City Council. They were considering what turned out to be a ballot initiative here in Denver that will increase our sales tax in order to create a new fund for homelessness resolution. And Enterprise has done work with, again, coalition partners on a social impact bond here. So I leaned into that expertise that Enterprise had in running that program, which this new fund, the new sales tax would create, would help support that kind of work. And so I took the opportunity to testify at City Council in support of the sales tax increase. It turned out really well for us because a Denverite reporter was on the call, and I didn't have to do anything additional with the reporter. She was able to take my statements given through the City Council meeting and highlighting the work that Enterprise and our partners have done with that social impact bond to support some news media, which got both Enterprise, but more importantly, the issues that we cared about into the press just by my participating in that City Council meeting. And it turned out even better because she came back to that quote and the meeting again for further articles. So it was the gift that kept on giving. So just to encourage you all to think about utilizing processes that exist and work that you're already doing and how you might get local media coverage for those pieces too in order to elevate your policy priorities. Katie already covered all of this for you. And there's my email address. I would welcome further thoughts and questions. So I'll hand it back to you, Robin.
Thanks, Kinsey. That was a lot of good information. And I just want to say that as you're thinking about if you're going through an op-ed, crafting, or looking at doing or thinking about earned media, again, we're here at Enterprise as resources for you as you're looking to build that out, especially if that's the first time you've approached something like that. I know as I worked in rural communities in Colorado. Many of the smaller rural papers have different publishing dates, different might not be daily, might be like biweekly or something like that. They also tend to be really hungry for good local stories. And so to the extent that you can provide them with high quality pictures and high quality stories about your work, you might just end up with a whole feature, which is a little bit different than how it works in the Denver Post, for example. So, so something to think about, but if you're interested in talking more about that, I'm always open to talk about how you could work to do that and tell your story. I think what Kathy brought up earlier as really telling stories from the perspective of the residents of your community is huge and can be really profound. So that's a really good lens, I think, too, as you're looking at those earned media pieces. So thank you so much, Kenzie. I'm going to pass it along to Jack. I've got to snooze this security update. And I'm going to share my screen, Jack, so that way you can see your slides. Jack Regenbogen is the senior attorney at the Colorado Center on Law and Policy and has been working very diligently as of late, which is the wrong word, but for late fees, like very diligently recently on regulating late fees and talking about late fees, particularly in light of COVID-19, but really, I think more broadly. And so Jack will be talking with us about what we can do at the local level and what's happening right now at the state level as well. So Jack, take it away.
Thank you so much, Robin and Kinsey, for putting this on this morning. And thank you to everyone else for joining us. Again, my name is Jack Regenbogen. I'm a senior attorney at the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. We're a nonprofit that advocates on behalf of Coloradans experiencing poverty. And today I wanted to talk about one particular tool that's in the local policy toolkit that can be really vital in terms of protecting housing stability and preventing the flood of evictions that is still likely to occur in 2021, barring any further policy interventions. And that's the issue of late fees. So what are rental late fees? Well, they're the fee that's often assessed against tenants when they make an untimely rental payment. One important thing to keep in mind is that these fees, at least from a legal perspective, are intended to reimburse a landlord for the actual out-of-pocket costs that they've incurred due to a late payment. So that means that they're not meant to be a source of additional revenue or profit. If a landlord is making money off of the late fee, that's not appropriate. Secondly, they're not meant to be a penalty. So they're really, you often hear about them as an incentive for tenants to pay on time. But legally speaking, that's not what they're intended to be used for. There's many other incentives for tenants to pay on time. The threat of eviction, of a diminished credit score report. Most renters want to pay rent on time. And so these are really meant to reimburse the landlord for whatever costs they have to incur because of the late payment. In many cases, those costs are already baked into the price of rent, in which case a late fee would be inappropriate. But when it's not, that's what these fees are intended to be. If we can move on to the next slide. Why are these fees a problem? Well, there's no state law, no state statute that regulates rental late fees. And so there's some common industry practices, but there's also a wide degree of variation from one landlord to the next. So that means that there's no limit on how much the fee can be. There's no cap. We see, based on some survey results, that the average fee tends to be around a little bit more than 30% of monthly rent if you factor in the daily late fees. Because in many cases, these are structured in such a way that there's an initial late fee and then there's a daily late fee added on top. And if you assume that someone is late for the entirety of the month, in many cases, the fee will exceed 30% of rent. So if rent is $1,000 a month, the fee will be an additional $300 or more. That's the average. But again, there's no state cap. And so landlords can charge theoretically as much as they want. And we've seen $50 a day late fees in some leases. That's perfectly legal under state law. Also, there's no grace period. And so as an industry practice, you might see some landlords who voluntarily refrain from charging a fee for X number of days. Maybe it's 3 days, maybe it's 5 days, maybe it's more. But all of that is completely voluntary. And in many cases, a fee is assessed the first second that that rent is considered late. Part of that deals with the automation of rental payments. Many people now are paying rent through an automated technology software that will automatically charge the late fee the first moment that rent is late. Also, and this is most important, is that late fee debt can be used as grounds for an eviction, even if the back rent is accounted for. That's important to keep in mind because many emergency rental assistance programs, including the POP program that Kinsey described, do not make funds available for late fee debt. And so even if people qualify for emergency rental assistance, in many cases, they're paying the late fee out of pocket. And if they can't, the late fee debt alone by itself can give rise to an eviction. A couple other problems: we see exorbitant interest rates charged on late fees. We also see these daily fees that I mentioned. That's a moving target because you think, I owe $100 as a late fee. You borrow some money from a friend or family member to pay that $100. By the time that you're able to, you come to find that it's actually $150 because of these daily fees. And so that increases someone's debt obligation every single day that they fall behind. And it can be impossible to catch up. And again, we also see that there are these automated payment portals that will prohibit a tenant from paying any amount unless they can pay the full amount. It's basically a software or a website that says you owe X amount of dollars, including late fees. And if you can't pay that full amount, it won't let you pay a cent. And so that compounds the problem because then it contributes to these daily late fees. Moving on. The good news is that because there's no state law that regulates rental late fees, it also means there's no state preemption. So this is an area of policy where local governments very much can take action in terms of regulating rental late fees. Now, initially, when I was planning to join you this morning, the call to action was to be related to a short-term temporary suspension of late fees. What we see now is that with the CDC order and with the supplemental eviction moratorium that was ordered this morning, there is some short-term relief that's been provided to tenants, but they're still liable for the back rent. And so even if they can't be evicted until January 1st, come 2021, they're going to be responsible for any amount of debt that's outstanding. Fortunately, at the end of last week on Thursday, Governor Polis issued an executive order that has suspended late fees for the remainder of the year. And that does provide some much needed short-term relief. Prior to that order, the only place in the state where late fees have been suspended was Broomfield. And I'm excited to hear more from Councilwoman Tessier in a few minutes to hear her perspective on how that was accomplished. But one thing to keep in mind right now is that although late fees are suspended for the next 2.5 months, they're going to be back on the table as an option for landlords beginning 2021, unless this executive order is extended or unless local governments take action on their own to extend the suspension for longer. However, permanent regulations of late fees have not been enacted in Colorado, not on the state level or in any municipality or county government. There was an attempt this year with a legislation, it was House Bill 1141, that would have added some common sense, reasonable guardrails around the imposition of late fees. Just for context, there are about between 15 to 20 states that have some type of late fee regulation. Colorado, of course, is not one of them. But had this bill passed, House Bill 1141, it would have established an 8-day grace period, so no late fees until those 8 days have lapsed. To put that into context, when homeowners fall behind on a mortgage payment, they are typically entitled to receive 15 days grace before they would be assessed a late fee. So 8 days is roughly half of what a homeowner would enjoy, but certainly more than 0, which is the current amount. The bill would have also added a cap on the amount of the late fee. So it would have been set at either 5% of monthly rent or $25, whichever is greater. In many cases, the 5% would be the greater amount, but for people who have subsidized rents, the $25 would have ensured a meaningful minimum amount. And then it also would have prevented evictions that are solely based on late fee debt. Now, of these components, the cap and the grace period are not preempted under state law, meaning that local governments can enact these on their own. The third component about evictions that are based on late fee debt, that is fixed in state law. And so that would require a state level legislation to change. But local governments certainly can consider on their own initiative enacting some reasonable policies around a cap and a grace period. And that would be tremendously helpful, not just as a pandemic response, but even before the pandemic, we saw these late fees contribute to the debt that tenants were owing and were a compounding factor in a number of evictions. There are some challenges in terms of enforcement. And so for local governments that are interested in considering this type of policy, probably the most straightforward way to enforce it is by creating a low-level municipal offense. But there are other options, such as allowing a city attorney's office to receive and investigate complaints. Moving on to the next slide. One thing I want to do is just make myself available as a resource. If this is something that you or your partners are interested in considering, I'm more than happy to jump on a call and to talk through the different policy nuances. But I really just want to reiterate how important the late fee component is in terms of preventing evictions. These fees really are meant to just reimburse the landlord for the costs that they've incurred. They're not meant to be an additional source of debt or profit that would compound someone's risk of eviction. And so to date, there hasn't been a single local government in Colorado that has enacted permanent late fee reform. And what I really hope to inspire today is a collective effort working together to try to pursue some of these solutions on the local level. With that, I'm excited to turn things over to Councilwoman Tessier, and I'm also happy to stick around and answer any questions you might have.
Great, Councilwoman Tessier, it looks like you're getting ready. Thank you for joining us. Councilwoman Tessier, as Jack mentioned, has been instrumental in getting the Broomfield ordinance on late fees passed, and is going to talk to us a little bit about that process and how that's worked, and what recommendations she might have for others who are thinking about undertaking that kind of regulation. So thank you very much for joining us today, Councilwoman, and I will give you the floor.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Jack, I have to say, you're probably one of the reasons why the ordinance that Broomfield put together was so successful. It took a ton of partnerships, and before we get going, I just want to, thank you all for inviting me to speak today. I think you've all become my new heroes, and reiterate to, I guess, the two previous speakers was, yes, your local government officials are accessible. We're the ones who help share your voice. So, it took a huge partnership to make this happen. And what I think is the most pivotal for how we were able to move this through is that in my day job, because Broomfield City Council are part-time councils, even though we're working full-time, but in my earning job, I am a housing advocate manager at our local family resource center, and I'm working with a lot of tenants and working with a lot of landlords, and the pandemic has really heightened and created such a need that we're so busy helping people who have lost their jobs, who have lost their security, and now you throw on, landlords charging late fees. And I was part of a conversation, a monthly conversation with different, I guess, council members and commissioners, and someone had mentioned Senior Attorney Jack Regenbogen, and I was like, well, who is this man? So I actually emailed him, and we started this conversation. And, you know, when I heard all of the reasons why late fees were intended, I thought we could really do something to help protect Broomfield residents. And I want to say, too, that we were really, really thoughtful in our process, because we know that a lot of landlords are doing the right thing. They had waived the late fees automatically. Most landlords are really decent, good people. So this wasn't about pitting landlords against tenants. This was about coming together to figure out how we can protect our residents who have lost everything, and now they might lose their house as well, or their home. So met with Jack, then pulled together a meeting with our city manager's office, had our senior attorney and other attorneys on board, along with the entire city manager's office, looked at how state preemption wasn't going to stop us from prohibiting late fees during COVID. And I think one of the main reasons why this was so successful is because of the pandemic, and because it is temporary. However, I think I would like to see this move forward in the future with regard to pandemic or no pandemic. You know, housing insecurity is something that is pretty much plaguing our nation, and it's, you know, a pandemic and epidemic here in the States. And most rural counties in Colorado experience 20% of their population being cost burdened or severely cost burdened. 1/4 of the nation's most rural counties have seen a sizable increase this decade in the number of households spending at least half of their income on housing. And then the average Colorado home price increased 77% in the last decade, but the state median's income went up just 4.5%. So there's this huge disconnect on how we can, you know, create housing stability and housing security for everybody. So back to the ordinance, it took myself and another councilwoman, Liz Law Evans, and while we are a nonpartisan council, you can imagine that our political affiliations are, you know, pretty much span the spectrum. And working with her, she would be maybe considered my opposite politically, but we have so much in common, and we really focused on what are the big issues here? What are we really trying to do? And we were trying to prevent homelessness, trying to prevent evictions, because we know it's a lot more cost effective to prevent homelessness than to actually address homelessness. And so we had many conversations about how, you know, the ordinance would look, and we invited many different landlords to the table. Most of the landlords were private landlords, and I can attest to what Jack talked about being here at the Family Resource Center. We have some landlords here in Broomfield who charge $200 for the first day someone is late, and then $50 thereafter. And there is no way someone can catch up if they've been impacted by COVID. And that is pretty extreme, but I think Broomfield, we're seeing maybe a little higher average than 30%, but it's why would we want to see people being evicted on late fees alone rather than being unable to pay their rent? It just seemed ludicrous to me. Also wanted to give prior to the state stepping in and Governor Polis with his executive order, we were able to actually use the ordinance in our county courts, and it was successful. Our ordinance pretty much proved to be legally binding that landlords who were trying to charge their tenants late fees while the tenant was impacted by COVID, they were unsuccessful in doing so, and the judge ordered the landlord to rewrite and take the late fees off. So the ordinance itself is just a fantastic, piece of paper, really, that's just stated that we believe that the coronavirus in Colorado is impacting many more residents and impacting tenants. And we wanted to provide the landlords the opportunity to collect their rent. And we also wanted the opportunity for the tenants to have some rent. And because there are so many different funding streams helping both the landlords through the POP funds, and we were educating landlords about where to access these funds and walking them through that process. We were also successful in talking to a lot of tenants and saying, hey, you need to fill out the CDC declaration. You need to, understand what your rights are, and you need to have conversations. And what's happened is that there have been really, really phenomenal conversations that maybe never would have happened between landlords and tenants, and a real big understanding about how this pandemic is affecting people. And my aim and my goal is to remind people that we are helping so many people stay housing secure. And that was the main emphasis. And so back to my councilwoman, Liz Law Evans, and she is a commercial real estate agent and a landlord as well. And we worked pretty diligently to make sure that everyone in the community knew that this was a bipartisan effort. This was an effort to protect our most vulnerable. This wasn't pitting one against the other. This was about how can Broomfield come together during this crisis. And, from what I see, the crisis is probably not going to go away. And we're, we're going to see this more in the future. But we were successful out of a 10 council member vote. It passed 9-1, and it was a great day for Broomfield to kind of show up and recognize that Broomfield is here for their most vulnerable at this point, and we're here to provide relief and that your home is not going to be taken away from you during this crisis. So I will stop there. I kind of talk fast and I talk in circles, but hopefully that's the gist of it. There was really no opposition that we got from we did get some opposition from some of the landlord organizations. However, we did bring this up to the Association of Landlords, and 4 of those members actually thought it was a really good idea. And one of the last things I will say is that a landlord that I recently had conversation with, he called me the other day and he was like, I am so grateful for having this conversation. And as a matter of, he owns a few different properties. And he said, I am actually doing away with my whole late fees. I think, it's wrong. And since there is no cap, it's clear how people could take advantage of one another. And so it's not that he won't evict people. And this isn't an anti-eviction. This is this is creating equity, so everybody has their equitable chance at staying housing secure. And the other thing I will say too is that for the future, you know, one of the biggest barriers that we're seeing, that I'm seeing as a housing advocate manager, is one of the biggest barriers to secure housing is previous evictions. And my hope is that we decriminalize evictions, so that maybe it takes 3 evictions before it actually shows up on someone's record. Because if you have one eviction, even if it's 7 years older or older, the likelihood of you securing an apartment to live in is slim to none. The other barrier is having to make 2.5 times the rent, which I think a lot of people are unable to do, because of the rise in cost of living and the not equitable or not parallel rise in our wages. So yes, it was hugely successful. It took many partnerships. It took a lot of conversations. And I think, you know, having the resources and having the public will and also reaching out to the community were huge in securing this ordinance to actually happen. So thank you so much. And I will stop there.
Great. Thank you, Councilwoman. It was really, I am so excited to hear that we have one thing that I'm taking away from both you and Kathy Meyer from Steamboat Springs is that it's really important that folks who actually understand housing run for local office and serve as our municipal leaders, because that helps us to make sure that we have folks telling those stories and championing those efforts. So any of you folks right now who are working in affordable housing advocacy in your local communities, think about it, a council membership when that time comes up, because I do think we have to share our insights, and we have really important stories to tell that need to be uplifted at the local level through policy. So
and
that is
I'm term limited. I'm term limited coming next November. So Ward 2, Broomfield, if you're interested.
Okay, got it. So we need to find a Ward 2 advocate to serve in Broomfield to keep that voice heard. Yeah, that's great. I feel like it's really important, since both of you were able to come from such a enlightened perspective on resident services and what's really needed in terms of advocacy, and that's really huge, I think, as we move forward. In lieu of having that champion kind of naturally on your city council, there's a lot of different pieces that we can do to bridge. I see that we did have one question come through chat from Steve Cordova, and I think Councilwoman Tessier, you answered this a lot, I think, from your perspective on how you worked with local landlords. But the question is, to what degree is there any concern that in the long term rental rates will be increased by landlords to offset the risks to eviction moratoriums and limiting late fees? And there's starting to be questions on local level from small landlords, those who own like 1 or 2 units, often standalone units, that are needing assistance to pay for their property loans while they're waiting for rental assistance to come through. So I actually, all of y'all who are up on screen, Kinsey, Jack, whatever insights, and Councilwoman Tessier, whatever insights you have, I'm interested to hear those.
I can start. I really appreciate the question and think it is an issue. Enterprise's position continues to be, while we strongly advocate for legal protections for at-risk tenants, that it has to be paired with sufficient funds, both for tenant and landlord, both for tenants and for landlords. And I think one of the things that I didn't talk a ton about in my presentation is what we see as a need to really prioritize, honestly, certain types of landlords. I think there's been a decent amount of research to this point throughout the pandemic, because we've been in a pandemic that long that there's enough research of the benefits of targeting available resources particularly to nonprofit and affordable housers, but also those smaller landlords of anywhere between 1 and a couple dozen units even, that they are the ones at greatest risk, as you point out, Steve, of losing their properties and not being able to maintain operations. And those are the properties where most often we see tenants at higher risk of eviction, as they're more likely to be lower income, lower wage earners, or otherwise marginalized. So I think we really, unfortunately, I don't see an easy answer, except to say that it is definitely a problem we see and a reason why we absolutely need more funding. We'll see what happens on November 3rd with any possibility of, future funding from the federal government after we get through the election. And at the same time, I think there is a responsibility to the state, and to the degree that we're able, local governments, to find additional monies through the course of 2021 and make sure they're getting to the folks who need it most, in part the folks you're pointing to. Jack or Councilwoman, I don't know if you'd like to add to that.
Jack, you go.
I agree that there needs to be more public investment to support both homeowners as well as tenants. Also, I apologize if you hear these bells in the background. I live next to a cathedral.
Lovely.
In any case, I just want to stress that the eviction moratorium does not relieve the rent debt. And so landlords are going to ultimately be paid back and made whole. And with public investment, hopefully that can happen sooner than later. There are still funds available through the Property Owner Preservation Program that Kinsey mentioned. And so I would encourage landlords, especially the smaller landlords, to apply for those. Ultimately, I do want to call attention to one of the policy recommendations in Kinsey's presentation, which is to allow for reasonable repayment opportunities. And that can be, what constitutes reasonable can depend on the individual circumstances of that tenant and that landlord. But the goal is to ultimately allow the landlord to be made whole and to be current on their mortgage obligations in a way that doesn't result in the displacement of the tenant. And right now, where we're still in the height of a pandemic, we really need to just prevent displacement in order to help curb the spread of COVID. And so I appreciate some of the out-of-the-box thinking that is being developed on both the local and state level to try to protect the interests of both homeowners and tenants.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd like to add on that is that I think it's important not to conflate the eviction moratorium with the late fee conversation, because late fees shouldn't be written into a pro forma from a operational perspective. And so to that point, I think that yes, if you're not getting rents paid, I think I understand completely how that's going to be hard in order for you to meet your operating needs, on the landlord end. But late fees shouldn't be, like I said, built into your operating bottom line from a developer or landlord perspective. So I think that late fees could be an easier way to work toward this that doesn't even that shouldn't really affect the landlords adversely unless they're taking advantage of this late fee lack of regulation. So I'm really pleased to have both of you here to talk about this. And I think it's such an important conversation. And I think there's really more conversations to be had on because we have so many different localities throughout the state. And I'm hoping that we can share your information with those who are on the call or as we record this call, so that others can reach out to you if they're looking to adopt this type of policy on the local level. And thank you all for your time. And to our panelists, I have one question come up. Oh, just to thank you, Steve, you're always so polite. You always thank us for these calls. And I really just want to thank all of y'all for your time. And again, this will be recorded. I'll send out a link to everyone, and have a great rest of your day and week. And yes,
thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.